Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Rafaela and I am back. I've been missing for about 3 weeks, if not longer actually. I went on holiday back home to Romania and I entered my reflection state of mind. Every time I go back home, I go back to my own apartment, which was given to me by my mother, and she had it from my grandmother. So there's a lot of old versions of me that still live between those four walls, and every time I go back, I sort of isolate for a little bit just to think about how far I've come in life and to take a moment to reflect upon all my prayers and to realize that some of them have been answered and that I am living through some of them without realizing. Sometimes life gets really busy and we pray for one thing and then we're on to the next praying for the other thing, and we sort of don't pay much attention to when blessings do come knocking on our door. But being there and reflecting and just thinking about everything, I sort of thought about why is it that in adulthood we go back to our childhood self so much? Why is it so important for us after we've grown to a certain age to go back and heal that inner child? And that idea sort of inspired today's journal entry, which is titled as The Circular Self. Now, I also got my cat. This is Mina. She's such a lovely little lady. I was able to travel with her from Romania as she was staying there until we sorted out all her vaccines and paperwork and everything. And here she is just to say hi for a little bit, and then she goes. She comes and she goes as she pleases, of course. But because lately I've been just reflecting on how strange growing up really is, I began to think that, when we are young, we sort of imagine adulthood to be this straightforward line. When I get older, I'm gonna do this, I'll be able to do that, I'll have more freedom, I'll have my own money, and so on and so forth. And I find that each year pulls us further away from who we once were, especially as New Year's comes around. We want to step into a better version of ourselves. We want to grow more. We set these resolutions and goals that we want to achieve. And no, don't go on the keyboard. Okay. All right. Can you move just a little bit? Just a little. There we go. Thank you, Mama. Where was I? I love her. She's literally the light of my life. I love her so much. But sometimes she could be really mean. Although she taught me love with boundaries. I think even though each year pulls us further away from who we once were, I don't think that maturity of wanting to become better and to step into a newer version of ourselves should mean shedding our childhood completely, replacing it with confidence and certainty and emotional distance. The older I get, the more I sort of realize that growing up isn't linear, but is actually circular. Circular because, like I said, with the idea of this journal entry, is that we sort of go back, right? I notice it in the small things, the music that I go back to, the shows that feel comforting in ways that I can't really logically explain. The nostalgia that suddenly feels less like longing and more like grounding. And I guess that those aren't just preferences, but they feel more like signals. Almost as if some part of me is asking to be acknowledged again. And as adults, we're taught to prioritize productivity and progress. Yet our nervous system seems to crave familiarity, safeness, softness, and many of those feelings were first experienced or missed during our childhood. And what's even more interesting for me is the way we start talking to ourselves as we grow older. there's a certain shift that happens, and it's often quiet, but we get to an age where we pause before we criticize ourselves, or we begin to use language that's more gentle, internally gentle on us, I would say. We start offering reassurance instead of punishments. And at times it feels like I'm speaking to someone younger than me, which is, my inner child. And it's like I'm guiding and comforting or protecting a version of myself that still exists beneath the surface deep down. And then that raises, of course, the important question for me of why does that happen? Why as adults do we instinctively turn inwards and begin addressing ourselves as though we are caring for a child? And I think it's because that child never disappeared, and it never will. I think we just sort of grow, but it always remains there within us. And I think in different ways, yet similar, we all sort of acknowledge that inner child still lives deeply within us. I think that when we are young, we don't have the power to fully process things like pain or confusion or emotional neglect, and instead we adapt. We learn to stay quiet, to be more agreeable, to grow up quickly because some circumstances just make it so to be, or to become emotionally self-sufficient. And now those coping mechanisms, they help us survive in that time period, but they don't heal anything. They simply carry unresolved experiences forward, waiting for a time when we could finally have that capacity to face them. And that often is when we are adults. Adulthood gives us something that we lack as children, which is perspective, language, and choice. And for the first time, we can look back at our experiences and understand them without being overwhelmed by them. It's also almost like stepping into another perspective from someone on the outside. You're sort of looking in on a situation and you have better judgment for it. And I think that that's why healing often begins in a later part of our life. Not because the wounds are new, but because we are finally strong enough to sit with them. That inner child isn't demanding attention out of weakness. It's now responding to safety. When life slows down enough, when we begin to feel stable or self-aware, those younger parts surface, not to disrupt us, but to be integrated. And I think that that's where the connection between the inner child and the adult self becomes essential. Healing doesn't mean reliving the past or staying stuck in it, but it means forming a relationship with it. When we speak kindly to ourselves, set boundaries, or allow rest without guilt, we are actively rewriting patterns that once taught us we had to earn love or safety. In becoming the adult we needed, we give our inner child permission to finally exhale, right? I hope that makes sense so far. And so something remarkable happens when that connection is made. The more we tend to the emotional needs that were once unmet, the more grounded and expansive we become as an adult. Creativity returns to us, joy feels safer, growth becomes then sustainable instead of forced. Flourishing isn't about perfection or detachment, it's about wholeness, and it's about allowing every version of yourself to coexist without shame or guilt. So maybe the reason we circle back to childhood as we grow older is not because we're regressing, but because we're completing something. We're closing loops that were left open. We're reclaiming parts of ourselves that were never really lost. They were just sort of waiting on us. And in doing so, we learn that healing doesn't pull us backwards, it anchors us. It gives our adult self roots strong enough to grow freely without fear of collapsing inwards again. Growing up then isn't about becoming someone new entirely, it's about remembering who we were before we learned how to define ourselves through the world's language, before expectations, before labels, and before categories began shaping how we should exist. In many ways, the archetype of who we would become was formed at the very beginning anyway, from that moment that we entered the world. So our truest version existed then, not because we were fully aware of it, but because we were untouched by interpretation. We didn't yet know how to perform, how to filter, or how to fracture ourselves to fit into something smaller. Even if we couldn't fully see it at the time, glimpses of that authenticity still lives within us to this day. And maybe that's why when life starts putting us into all these different boxes, naming us, measuring us, assigning meaning to who we are and how we should behave, we feel an ache to return, not to escape that responsibility, but to remember freedom, to revisit the version of ourselves that existed before comparison, before judgment, before limitations. The youngest version of us was the sole author of their dreams, their fantasies, their future, and of their character, more importantly. Nothing had been narrowed down yet, and everything was still possible. And so perhaps healing at its core is about reconnecting with that origin, not to stay there, but to carry its truth forward so that we can build a life that feels aligned, expansive, and genuinely ours. And that is all I have for today. That is all I managed to write, or at least remember from my experience, because I didn't write this in Romania. I think I was very stuck in just living in the present moment there. But now that I am back in France, I rewrote whatever I remembered from it. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, let me know, what do you do to stay connected to your inner child? If you have any sort of routine or rituals that you do. I know for me a big one is prayer, and journaling, and just going back to, I guess the easiest one would be going back to certain songs from my childhood. But like I said at the start of this video, I get to go back to literally where I came from, and I'm very grateful to have that opportunity to be in my adult body and go somewhere where I grew up, where, you know, my whole life started there. So I'm very grateful to do that and be in that space. It feels very safe for me to do so. And yeah, I hope you all take care of yourselves, and I shall see you next time. Bye bye.